Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, squelchy walk through the grime and glory of medieval Europe, from the soggy streets to the smelly socks, and the shoes that barely kept your feet alive. You're going to step into an era where a casual stroll could mean trench foot, and the nearest cobbler might be stitching with gut string and a hope. Your shoes. Probably 2 sizes off, if you were lucky enough to own any. And your socks. Well, let's just say they didn't come in cotton. You'll wander muddy markets, avoid suspicious puddles, and breathe in the bouquet of animal droppings, spoiled ale, and centuries of feet that never saw a proper scrub. Honestly, you probably won't survive this, not with your modern nose, at least. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake after this, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into a typical medieval town just after dawn, boots, or maybe bare feet, sinking into the uneven sludge that lines every street. It isn't just mud. Oh no. This is a special kind of medieval mix, straw and soil, yes, but also food scraps, human waste tossed from windows, horse manure, spoiled fish, and whatever fell off a cart and was never claimed. Some historians even debate whether pavement was more aspirational than practical. Many towns had cobbles in name only. As you shuffle forward, your toes curl instinctively at the texture of what just squished between them. You glance down, but it's already vanished into the thick brown pool that might be 2 inches, or 2 feet, deep. You won't find a drain nearby. Wastewater meanders in shallow gullies along the center of the road, and everyone's just hoping gravity takes care of things. Now and then, a wooden plank bridge stretches over the foulest stretch. Wealthier folks might cross without touching the ground at all, their servants laying fabric, or even carrying them. For everyone else, it's a gamble, where to step, what to avoid, and how to pretend that wasn't something dead floating past your ankle. Mainstream history tells us that cities like London and Paris passed early sanitation laws, requiring waste to be dumped in designated places, not into streets. But enforcement? That depended entirely on who you were. A knight might toss his chamber pot wherever he liked. A peasant? Fined 2 pennies, assuming he had them. To cope, people stuffed their nostrils with herbs or walked with scented pomanders. But you just breathe through your mouth and hope for a breeze. A quirky footnote in some town records mentions the mysterious appearance of pigs wallowing freely in city streets. These weren't wild, they were someone's livestock. But they also acted as organic garbage disposal systems, snuffling through rotting food and even gnawing on bones. Which sounds thrifty, until one bites a child, or topples a cart. Several cities actually banned unlicensed pigs, after a bishop was reportedly trampled by a particularly enthusiastic sow. You look up, hoping for a bit of escape, but the narrow buildings lean inward. Upper floors almost kiss overhead. Ropes dangle between windows, laundry sagging with yesterday's river water. You hope it's just water. The smells follow you, thick and inescapable. And under it all, beyond the spoiled cabbage, wet wool, sour beer, is that human funk. Feet. So many feet. Their owners' shoes, if they have them, do little to help. Most are open leather sandals or cracked turn shoes with no soles. Wet socks, if worn, squelch with each step. Historians still argue whether medieval folks were truly dirty by choice, or simply limited by infrastructure. Water was sacred, hard to come by, and usually unsafe. Boiling it was tedious. Bathhouses existed, but only the well-off could go often. And washing your feet? That was something monks did symbolically, everyone else just scraped the worst off with a stick. Still, there was etiquette. In some towns, removing your boots before entering a home or church was expected. Not doing so could mark you as an outsider, or just incredibly rude. You pass a shoemaker's stall. Strips of hide hang from the roof, drying stiff in the morning sun. A child sits nearby, stitching soles with thread made from animal sinew. He blinks at you sleepily, his hands moving with practiced rhythm. His own feet are bare, cracked, and bleeding just a little. He doesn't flinch when a beetle crawls across his toe. You hear the clack of pattens, wooden overshoes worn to elevate one's regular shoes above the mess. They echo like miniature clogs. Richer citizens sometimes strap these on to preserve their fashionable footwear. One woman clatters past, lifting her skirts high, revealing fine leather boots and silk socks. Possibly. Or just well-oiled linen trying to pass as silk. Then, a dog yelps as someone trips over it. You look over and see a man face down in muck, shoe torn clean off, revealing a foot wrapped in what appears to be old cloth, or maybe a cabbage leaf. Hard to say. No one helps him. He groans and rolls into the shadow of a cart. You keep walking. That's all you can do. The sun rises higher, but the streets don't smell better. They just smell warmer. More pungent. Alive. And everywhere, under every footstep, you carry the weight of it, centuries of movement, decay, and survival, all pressed into this foul carpet beneath you. You move away from the market's heaviest sludge, sidestepping a collapsed basket of onions and what might be a chicken foot, unattached, and nobody seems concerned. The ground remains uneven, your own footing less than certain, and now you're beginning to feel it, the strain in your arches, the ache in your ankles, the slow, creeping heat that signals a blister preparing its debut. Welcome to barefoot life in medieval Europe. If you were poor, and let's be honest, you probably were, going barefoot wasn't a lifestyle choice, it was economic reality. Shoes were expensive, even the most basic ones. For many peasants, footwear was reserved for church, feast days, or long journeys. Otherwise, you walked barefoot, rain or shine, frost or mud, through fields, forests, and occasionally, very sharp things. You pass a young boy perched on a doorstep, peeling bark from a stick with bare, muddy feet dangling above a puddle. His toes are splayed wide, the nails dark with grime, and his heel is split and calloused like old leather. He notices you watching and grins, a gap-toothed smirk full of confidence only a barefoot child could manage. You try not to limp in response. There's an odd pride in going unshod. In some areas, it was almost a badge of rustic honor, proof you could take the earth's punishment and keep walking. But those feet paid the price. Blisters bubbled, splinters festered, and winters brought a whole new level of suffering. Chilblains. Cracked skin. Even frostbite. Yet somehow, generations survived it. Of course, not everyone was totally barefoot. People got creative. Bits of cloth were wrapped around the soles, tied with string or thin leather. Straw was twisted into crude footpaths. And then there were socks, though the word might be a bit generous. Historians still debate what counts as a sock in this era. The Latin term soccus originally referred to a kind of slipper, and its meaning changed wildly over the centuries. In the early medieval period, especially before the 12th century, what passed for a sock could be anything from a tightly wrapped linen foot binding to tubes of wool tied with twine. Elastic hadn't been invented yet, so socks were less about snug fits and more about stuffing and hope. You pass a weaver's stand. Bundles of woolen yarn dangle from a rack, dyed in the muted hues of madder root and woad. A woman spins while keeping one foot tucked up under her skirts, perhaps it's warmer that way, or maybe she's hiding a hole in her footwear. Or a lack of it entirely. A scrap of conversation catches your ear, something about intestine socks. No, you didn't mishear. In colder regions or among particularly resourceful, or desperate, folks, animal intestines were sometimes cleaned, stretched, and wrapped around the feet for insulation. Not comfortable. Not breathable. But warm-ish and waterproof-ish. It's the kind of solution born from staring at a sheep's remains and thinking, there has to be a use for this. You press onward, each step forcing you to imagine the sensation: cold earth, rough stone, sudden patches of slimy moss. Every texture communicates directly to the soles of your feet, and medieval folks would have developed toughened skin like armor. Their feet were the medieval equivalent of hiking boots. Still, going barefoot wasn't always a sign of poverty. Some religious orders practiced it deliberately. Humility, penance, connection with the suffering of Christ. You might see a friar crossing town with nothing but calloused soles and serenity to protect him from the gravel. Meanwhile, noble feet were corseted in embroidered slippers and warmed by fur-lined boots, even in summer, because comfort was status. You turn into a narrower alley now, where the sun barely filters through. The smell changes again, less dung, more mildew. A cat slinks past, its own paws silent and superior. You, on the other hand, stub your toe on a chunk of broken crockery, and it's all you can do not to scream. Foot injuries weren't small matters in medieval life. A deep cut, infected blister, or untreated wound could lead to sepsis. Without antibiotics, even minor foot damage could be life-threatening. That's why many people wrapped their feet in herbal poultices at night, comfrey, mugwort, even mashed leeks. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it just made things smell worse. And yes, the smell was a constant. If feet could sweat, they would. If shoes existed, they rarely breathed. And socks, well, try wearing boiled wool in July and see how long your friends stick around. There's a record from a 13th century manor that mentions the punishment of a serf who stole a neighbor's socks from the communal drying line. It's unclear whether this was because the thief had none, or because those socks were unusually aromatic. Either way, he received a fine and a public beating. Moral of the story: keep your socks to yourself. And let's not forget blister management. Without modern plasters or antiseptics, people turned to lard, beeswax, or even goose grease. Some accounts describe scraping off the top of a blister with a hot knife. Others recommend letting it air dry, which in medieval terms means walking around on it until it popped naturally. You wince just thinking about it. You finally reach a well-trodden patch of grass near the edge of town. Someone's laid out a few rush mats. A woman reclines there, feet up, tending to a red, swollen heel with a needle and what looks like vinegar-soaked cloth. She glances at you, then back to her task. It's an ordinary sight. Because in this world, your feet weren't just a mode of transport, they were survival tools. They took you to the market, to mass, to harvest fields and battlefields. They got bruised, burned, and battered, and still had to carry you home at the end of the day. So, whether you were trudging barefoot through manure, wrapping your toes in sheep guts, or dreaming of socks that didn't itch, one thing was certain: your feet never had it easy. You pause to rest beneath the low awning of a thatched alehouse. Your feet are sore, even in this imagined world, and the idea of slipping them into something soft and dry has never sounded better. But of course, soft and dry weren't exactly common descriptors for medieval footwear, especially when it came to socks. Or rather, what passed for socks. Let's rewind the evolution a bit. Before socks, there were foot wraps, strips of cloth wound around the foot and lower leg in overlapping layers. Still used by soldiers as late as World War I, these were an early answer to, what do I do if I can't afford real socks? And in medieval Europe, most people couldn't. Wool was pricey, linen even more so, and knitting hadn't yet gone mainstream. So, peasants made do with what they had: torn tunic scraps, bits of old cloaks, or rough-spun cloth, often recycled to the point of translucency. You can imagine the sensation: each layer trapping heat and sweat, seams bunching between your toes, the constant need to stop and rewrap to avoid painful folds or chafing. Historians still argue whether these were worn more for warmth or for blister prevention, but either way, they were as far from luxurious as foot coverings get. Not everyone relied solely on wrappings, though. Gartered hose, a kind of long, tight-fitting legging, was a step up. Men and women both wore them, often tied to belts or doublets with thin cords. Think leggings, but less, yoga studio, and more, unwashed wool sausage casing. These hose often extended over the foot entirely, meaning you got both sock and pant leg in one damp, itchy package. Of course, these garments sagged constantly. And since elastic hadn't yet graced the earth, people relied on garters, bands tied just under the knee, to hold everything in place. Losing a garter in public could lead to some truly undignified scrambling. It's no wonder fashion evolved toward the doublet hose combo, one piece, less to fall off, and fewer public humiliations. Still, the need for true, independent socks persisted. You spot a traveling merchant unpacking his wares on a nearby stall. Among the bolts of cloth and metal trinkets are, something odd. Two very thin, very delicate tubes of fine red wool, almost glowing in the afternoon sun. These are the status symbol socks of the medieval elite. Carefully knitted, yes, knitted, finally, and imported from places like Spain or Italy. These were not worn to walk through mud. They were worn to be seen. Knitting in medieval Europe began its rise around the 12th century, likely introduced via Muslim Spain. It was complex, time-consuming, and reserved for the wealthy. Fine knitted socks, sometimes called stockings, were prized possessions. Some were even mentioned in wills. To my niece, I leave my blue silk stockings with silver-threaded toes. Practical? Not really. But highly desirable. Meanwhile, back in the peasant sphere, a different kind of sock existed, less elegant, more experimental. Felted wool foot bags. Imagine a toddler's craft project, a kind of pillowcase for the foot, clumsily stitched with whatever thread or sinew was lying around. Functional in the way a mitten is functional on the wrong hand. But if it kept your foot from freezing off, it was good enough. A fringe detail emerges in some historical records, a curious mention of stuffed hose. This likely refers to padded socks or hose filled with down, moss, straw, or even horsehair for warmth. Not unlike medieval UGG boots. Well, maybe UGH boots. One particularly entertaining account comes from the court of Burgundy, where servants were reportedly punished for wearing borrowed, padded hose meant for noble use. Whether it was for fashion or just survival, the implication was clear: nice socks weren't for you. You walk on, passing through a residential quarter where laundry lines stretch between windows like weary prayer flags. A gust of wind flips a long sock, crudely patched, heavily stained, off the line. It flutters to the ground and lands near a chicken, who investigates with mild interest. No one hurries to retrieve it. The reality is, medieval socks were fragile. They tore easily, wore thin in days, and were rarely washed. Water scarcity, the expense of soap, and the labor involved meant that socks, like undergarments, were only washed when absolutely necessary. Which, depending on your nose, was never. Still, some people tried. You pass a woman crouched near a wooden washtub, scrubbing a length of cloth that might be part of a sock. The water is brownish. She slaps it against a stone, wrings it out, and lays it over a hedge to dry. It will smell slightly better for a few days. Slightly. Some monasteries took sock repair seriously, especially those with rules on communal clothing. You might find a monk assigned to patching worn hose, quietly stitching in candlelight with fingers already blistered from farm work. For a humble brother in Christ, a well-mended sock might be one of life's few luxuries. But socks weren't just functional, they could also be symbolic. In some medieval rituals, washing someone's feet and clothing them with fresh socks signified humility, forgiveness, or hospitality. This tradition echoes through centuries, and still lingers in religious practices today. You pass a cobbler's workshop where a row of tiny woolen booties hangs near the window, likely for children. Knitted in one piece, probably from homespun yarn, and shaped vaguely like a foot if you squint. They're adorable and horrifying in equal measure. And they wouldn't last a week on cobblestones. Back on the main road, you begin to feel every detail again, the scrape of rock through your worn soles, the itch of imagined wool against your ankle, the weight of dirt slowly pressing its way into every crease. Suddenly, even modern gym socks seem like a miracle. Cushioned heels. Moisture-wicking. You're practically a god. And yet, somehow, those who came before survived the centuries with moss-filled stockings and unraveling hose. They walked miles on frozen ground, blistered and bruised, and called it normal. So, the next time you pull on a fresh pair of socks, just remember, someone once looked at a length of linen, some pig fat and a pile of straw, and thought, this'll do just fine. The road turns rockier as you leave the tangled bustle of the village and follow the sound of hammering, sharp, steady, rhythmic. You're approaching a cobbler's corner. There, beneath a low-beamed overhang, sits a man hunched over a wooden bench, his fingers pulling sinew thread through thick leather with a boar bristle needle. It's slow, meticulous work. His expression? A blend of concentration, resignation, and someone deeply familiar with blisters not his own. Welcome to the medieval world of shoemaking, where every pair was hand-stitched, half miracle, half mistake. You watch as he flips the upper leather over the last, a wooden foot mold, then tacks it to the insole with tiny wooden pegs. No glue here, just animal hide and geometry. He dips his fingers in a pot of oil, slicks the leather, then scores a line for stitching. The awl, a pointed metal tool, punches hole after precise hole. It's not quiet work, but it's oddly soothing. Repetitive. Hypnotic. The kind of thing you could fall asleep to, if not for the cowhide fumes. Now and then, he mutters to himself, something about the grain stretching too much, or the sole warping in the damp. These are common woes. You see, leather in the medieval world was a stubborn beast. Literally. Cowhide had to be tanned, softened, soaked in urine, yes, that's real, and left to dry. Some was smoked. Some was treated with oak bark. And if done poorly, your boots would curl like toast in a fire. You notice the tools, curved knives, wooden mallets, a little pot of beeswax, a hammer that looks too small to do any real damage. Yet every piece is crucial. The wax keeps the thread strong and water-resistant. The bristles make stitching possible. The knife trims the sole, which is layered on like lasagna, soft leather uppers, stiff midsole, rawhide bottom. And yes, shoes were often made without distinct lefts and rights. One symmetrical shape fit both feet, maybe. If your foot was unusually wide or short, tough luck. Some cobblers would adjust patterns, but most just assumed your foot would break in the shoe over time. You limped, blistered, and slowly reshaped it with your misery. Historians still argue whether this symmetry was intentional design or sheer practicality. Making shoes was already labor-intensive. Producing 2 mirrored patterns per pair. That doubled the trouble. Simpler to cut once and let your customer sort it out later. A boy nearby is stitching the edge of a turned shoe, a soft, flexible shoe worn by most people, especially indoors. You watch him pull the leather inside out like a sock. That's why they're called turn shoes. They're sewn while inside out, then flipped to hide the seams. They're not waterproof, not especially sturdy, but they're better than bare feet, and cheaper than boots. The cobbler's hands are covered in calluses, his nails dark with dye and dirt. His own shoes. A patched mess of overlapping scraps, clearly repaired more times than they were originally made. You notice he's added a layer of felt beneath the sole, probably to muffle his steps or protect against the chill. Medieval shoemakers often experimented with padding, cork, moss, even wool stuffed into hidden pockets beneath the heel. You hear a grunt from behind you. Another customer approaches, lifting his tunic to show a broken lace and a sole flapping like a second tongue. The cobbler doesn't blink. He waves the man to sit and begins unlacing the shoe, muttering about the cursed damp and soft-soled sinners. The man shrugs, resigned to the ritual. Nearby, several pairs of shoes hang from a rack, some simple slip-ons, others with long straps for wrapping up the ankle. A few are decoratively punched with holes, ventilation, fashion, or maybe just wishful thinking. One pair is dyed a deep burgundy, probably for a wealthier client. Dye was expensive, and red, in particular, had strong social signals. Nobles wore it. Clergy flirted with it. Peasants didn't dare. Then there are boots, tall, laced, and slightly terrifying. These were worn by travelers, messengers, and those with serious ground to cover. Laces run up the side, tied with knotted cords. Some boots include hobnails, small metal studs hammered into the soles to increase durability. They worked, but made you clank like a medieval percussion section. And there's something else, shoes made from multiple kinds of leather. Cowhide for the sole, goat for the upper, pig for the tongue. The choices weren't random. Each had different strengths. Pigskin was flexible but tough, cowhide was sturdy, and goatskin, while delicate, held dye beautifully. The best shoes blended these like a stew. A quirky detail. Some cobblers marked their shoes with personal stamps, tiny symbols pressed into the sole or inner lining. This wasn't branding, it was protection. If your shoes fell apart after 2 days, and the cobbler was still around, you could return them, likely yelling. But if the shoe bore someone else's mark, well, your anger needed a new address. One corner of the shop displays tools that seem almost surgical. Narrow punches, curved awls, tongs. It dawns on you, these people weren't just craftspeople, they were foot doctors by necessity. A shoe too tight could cripple a man. One too loose could wreck a harvest. And since most people had only one pair, maybe two, if lucky, there wasn't much room for error. The cobbler wipes his forehead, leans back, and stretches his arms. His shoulders crack audibly. Then, he begins a new pair. Another customer waits by the doorway, holding a child's muddy turn shoes in one hand, a chicken under the other arm. You wonder how many steps those shoes will take, across fields, into town, maybe even into the next life. There's something oddly noble about that. Each stitch, each knot, part of a story no one will ever read. And as the cobbler sets his awl to work again, you realize, in a world where feet never had a break, the cobbler never really did either. You leave the cobbler's stall and wander toward the town square, where the atmosphere shifts. The muddy ruts give way, only slightly, to cleaner paths lined with decorative stone. There's music playing somewhere, a flute maybe, and the smell of roasting chestnuts wafts from a stall. But what really catches your eye is a pair of feet. Toes, 6 inches ahead of where they should be. A young nobleman struts across the square, his shoes stabbing the air with absurdly long points. These aren't just shoes. These are polanes, the medieval equivalent of walking on exaggerated punctuation marks. Slender, curled tips, some stiffened with wire or stuffed with moss, extending half a foot or more beyond his toes. He's probably tripped twice already, but he's playing it off with the confidence of someone who knows their shoes cost more than your house. Polanes were the ultimate medieval foot flex. They said, I don't need to run. I don't need to work. My servants carry the manure and I float. They were popular among the European nobility in the 14th and 15th centuries, particularly in Poland, hence the name, before strutting their way across the continent. You can't help but imagine the awkward logistics. Sitting down. Climbing stairs. Using a chamber pot. Historians still debate whether wearers tied the tips to their knees with ribbons to avoid flopping them around, or whether they just accepted their fate and learned to walk like herons. One chronicler wrote with disgust about young men whose polanes were longer than their legs had reason to support, while a monk in France described them as the devil's claws. The church, unsurprisingly, hated them. In fact, clergy railed against fashionable shoes regularly, condemning pointy toes, colored leather, even elaborate stitching as signs of vanity and moral decay. And yet, the trend persisted. A woman walks by next. Her shoes are more demure, but still elegant. Soft leather with slightly pointed toes, the kind of design you could wear to a wedding, or a war council, depending on the guest list. Her dress is lifted just high enough to show her ankles. Scandalous. In some towns, laws dictated how much of the female foot could be publicly visible. Too much. You were asking for attention. Or worse, judgment. Sumptuary laws, those delightful little rules designed to remind you of your place, were particularly strict about shoes. In England, a statute once forbade anyone below the rank of gentleman from wearing polaines with points longer than 2 inches. Imagine pulling out a ruler to prove your social standing. Violators could be fined, or publicly mocked, or both. You pause at a fountain, watching another dandy pick his way across the stones. His polaines drag slightly, and you notice a telltale wear pattern. The toes have been stitched and restitched, almost lovingly. These shoes are delicate, impractical, and fussy. And they absolutely do not survive a rainy season. In fact, a fringe theory among costume historians claims polaines were sometimes stuffed with fragrant herbs, not for scent, but for structure. Basil, rosemary, thyme, keeping your status high and your toes upright. Of course, not everyone wanted to be a foot peacock. Pragmatic nobles opted for ankle boots or laced shoes with small brass decorations. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of dress loafers, formal enough for court, functional enough for a hunt. These might feature fine embroidery, gold thread stitching, or tiny bells that jingled softly as you walked. You spot a pair now, shoes dyed deep blue with brass buckles polished to a blinding shine. Their wearer, a portly merchant with too many rings and not enough chin, adjusts his hat and smiles at passers-by as if to say, "Yes, I'm rich enough to walk on art." Interestingly, many nobles didn't even put on their own shoes. That was the job of a valet or maid. Feet were massaged, powdered, and slipped into custom shoes like precious relics. A noble might own dozens of pairs, each fitted to a specific activity, court appearances, travel, dancing, or looking dramatically out windows. But even nobles suffered. Tight shoes caused bunions, corns, and crooked toes, problems preserved forever in skeletons recovered from noble graves. Some wore padded hose under their shoes to ease the pain. Others simply lived with the ache, because status was worth limping for. Quirkily enough, some polaines were detachable at the toe. Like early foot armor, the tips could be unfastened, either to walk properly or to save wear. It's as if your shoe had its own fancy hat that you removed for casual Fridays. Historians are still undecided on just how widespread these were. Some sources claim they were common. Others suggest they were rare novelties. The truth, as with most medieval fashion, likely falls somewhere in the messy middle. A crowd gathers as a small procession enters the square. You catch a glimpse of a noblewoman's feet, barely visible beneath velvet skirts, and her shoes glint in the sun. Gilded leather, stitched with seed pearls. Impractical in every possible way. But beautiful. And just behind her, a servant shuffles in worn shoes patched with mismatched leather, toes poking out like tired snails. The contrast is staggering. 2 feet apart, 2 different worlds. And yet both belong to the same moment in time, stepping side by side into history. You walk on, amused and a little in awe. For all its filth and hardship, medieval Europe still found time to care, deeply, obsessively, about shoes. Even if they hurt. Even if they flopped. Even if the church threatened eternal damnation for wearing them. Because in the end, what's more human than a bad fashion choice? You were proudly on your feet. You follow the noble procession out of the square and down a winding lane that gradually shifts from tidy cobbles to rough-packed earth. The buildings get lower, roofs shabbier, chickens more plentiful. You're entering the world of peasants, the ones who didn't wear polaines, didn't have servants, and didn't care if the church thought their shoes were too humble. These were the feet that truly carried medieval Europe. Outside a cottage, a woman sits on a stool, scraping something with a dull blade. It's not food, it's hide. A section of pigskin, stretched taut across a frame, still dotted with bristles and carrying the faint smell of smoke and breakfast. She's tanning it the hard way, using homemade lye from ash and a bit of animal fat. She wipes her brow, then returns to the scraping with methodical patience. You realize she's making shoes. Not fashionable ones. Not elegant. Just functional. Peasant shoes were often made at home, from whatever materials were cheapest, or at hand. That usually meant cowhide, if you could afford it. But pigskin was more common, and bark glue helped hold the pieces together. The design. Rudimentary. Think a pouch for your foot, stitched at the sole, maybe with side seams or a heel flap. Sturdy, but only barely. She tosses the finished hide to her husband, who begins cutting it with a curved blade. He's tracing around a wooden board roughly the size of his foot. You can see where past patterns have overlapped, ink smudges layered like footstep ghosts. They'll stitch the sole first, then pierce the upper with an awl and thread it through. Thread, by the way, isn't thread. It's animal sinew, dried, twisted, and waxed. Or sometimes gut string, boiled and stretched thin. And the needle? Boar bristle or sharpened bone, depending on the century. Sewing wasn't gentle work. Your fingers bled. Your palms calloused. And if you messed up a stitch, you either lived with the blister or started over. You glance at a pair of finished shoes near the hearth. They look rigid. Like something carved, not worn. That's because they probably are. Untreated leather was stiff as wood, and breaking in a new pair meant days of pain. There's a reason many peasants preferred to go barefoot indoors. Shoes were for work, travel, or harsh weather, not comfort. Some shoes included a thin layer of wool sewn inside, but most peasants simply stuffed them with straw in winter. And in particularly wet regions, moss was added. It absorbed moisture, but, let's just say it had other consequences. One medieval physician blamed moss-lined shoes for a plague of toe boils. A fringe theory, maybe, but you still wince just imagining it. Historians still argue whether peasant shoes had standard sizing. Evidence suggests most were made to rough measurements, his foot plus 2 fingers, or copied from someone else's shoes. There was no left and right. You wore them, limped for a few weeks, and eventually your foot bullied the leather into compliance. A boy races past, barefoot and laughing. He's dragging a stick, stirring up dust, and you glimpse his heel, bandaged, maybe burned. You wonder how many times a child's foot met a hearth coal, a sharp rock, a rusty nail. Yet he doesn't flinch. Peasant children learned early to endure, and their feet bore stories far beyond their years. Back near the cottage, the man finishes sewing and begins shaping the shoe over his foot. He wiggles his toes, trims the edge, then dips the sole into a bucket of thick, black resin. That's waterproofing, pine pitch, beeswax, sometimes tar. It's sticky, noxious, and surprisingly effective. You can practically smell it as it sizzles in the midday sun. Next to him sits a wooden frame with iron spikes poking up, an improvised drying rack. Shoes were hung upside down to dry, the leather slowly relaxing into shape. But there's a catch: if you let them dry too fast, they cracked. Too slow, they mildewed. Finding the sweet spot was an art form all its own. You peek inside the cottage. By the hearth, a woman is patching an old shoe, the sole flapping like a loose tongue. She's sewing in silence, one eye on a bubbling pot, the other on the needle. In homes like this, shoes were inherited, passed down, and repaired until they resembled patchwork sculpture more than footwear. Another curious fact. Some peasants oiled their shoes with animal fat to keep them pliable. Goose grease, lard, even fish oil. The smell lingered, of course, especially on warm days. But priorities were different back then. Smell ranked well below, will this shoe rot off my foot? Still, there were moments of creativity. Decorative stitching, colored thread, even tiny copper buckles or bells, usually saved for feast days or weddings. One recorded inventory from a peasant bride lists one pair of boots, dyed with walnut shell, for Sundays only. Shoes, even ugly ones, could carry sentimental weight. You spot an old man resting on a tree stump, his boots unlaced, socks rolled halfway down his calves. One toe pokes through a hole. He doesn't seem to mind. He's lived through too many harvests, too many winters, too many hours spent chasing lost sheep across muddy fields to care if his feet look polished. A donkey trots past, and for a second, you notice its hooves, shod with crude iron plates nailed in place. You chuckle. In a way, the donkey might have the sturdiest shoes in town. So you take a final look at the peasant shoe, rough, functional, forgettable. But these were the shoes that fed cities, marched in forgotten militias, and danced, yes, danced, at midsummer festivals in the grass. They weren't designed to last centuries. But some have, buried in bogs or unearthed from cellar floors, still clinging to a toe print worn in hard. You walk on, the echo of those stiff soles still in your ears, and realize, fashion fades. But necessity? That walks forever. You've almost grown accustomed to the rhythm of footsteps, your own included, when you realize something's been following you all along. Not a person, not a dog, but a smell. Or rather, a chorus of smells. And the longer you walk, the clearer it becomes, it's not just the muck in the street. It's feet. Everyone's feet. Yours included. Foot odor in medieval Europe wasn't some occasional inconvenience, it was a persistent presence, woven into the fabric of daily life like the scent of smoke or wet wool. Shoes rarely came off. Socks, if they existed, were changed infrequently. Baths? Occasional luxuries. And your average medieval boot was a dark, moist cave perfect for growing things. You pass a soldier, seated on a barrel, unlacing his thick leather boots. The moment his foot slips free, a wave of something earthy and sour hits your nose like a warhammer. His companion doesn't flinch. They're used to it. The boot is flipped over, dumped out, and a pebble, some straw, and something disturbingly fungal fall to the ground. Fungus was common, athlete's foot before it had a name. Cracked heels, peeling skin, strange rashes, and a condition charmingly referred to in one 14th century herbal as rot of the toes. A medical manuscript from the time recommended crushed garlic and goose grease as a remedy. Not because it worked especially well, but because it was better than doing nothing. Barely. You walk on, following your nose now more than your feet. The scent shifts subtly from acrid leather to wet wool, to something vaguely barn-like. A boy selling meat pies lifts one leg and scratches his foot through a hole in his shoe. You try not to watch. A fringe theory among hygiene historians, yes, they exist, suggests that medieval folk were less bothered by foot odor simply because everything smelled. When your home stank of soot, dung, and pickled cabbage, a pair of ripe boots wasn't especially alarming. But they noticed it, oh yes, they did. That's why people stuffed fragrant herbs in their shoes. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were common. So was sage, believed to ward off evil spirits and unpleasant scents, possibly the same thing. You can picture it, a pair of cracked leather-turned shoes with sprigs of rosemary poking out like a failed bouquet. One quirky remedy involved tucking dried orange peel or cloves into the toe of your shoe, both for scent and supposed protection against illness. Medieval medicine loved the idea of bad air causing disease. Stinky feet? Probably dangerous. Probably contagious. Better safe than sorry, stuff that clove in deep. You pause at a bathhouse, a rare and oddly inviting sight. Steam rises through a shuttered window. Inside, wealthy townsfolk soak in large wooden tubs, attendants scrubbing their backs with brushes made from horsehair and lye soap. A pile of shoes sits outside the door. You lean closer, curious. The pile is impressive, soft leather slippers, velvet-topped boots, sandals with braided straps. And the smell? Pungent. Complex. Like if you boiled mushrooms in a dirty sock. A few towns kept regulations about foot hygiene. In some convents, nuns were required to wash their feet weekly. In monasteries, the ritual foot washing held both practical and spiritual meaning. Clean feet meant clean souls. Maybe. It also just meant fewer arguments over who got the bottom bunk. You remember a passage from a 13th century household guidebook, one of those endlessly specific texts where someone clearly had too much time. It advised noblewomen to keep foot balm on hand, a mixture of goose fat, rosewater, and cinnamon, meant to soothe and scent tired feet. Probably more cinnamon than science, but at least it masked the funk. Even so, many people simply lived with the smell. Peasants had no extra herbs, no fragrant oils, and no time to soak their feet after 14 hours in the fields. Children ran barefoot. Adults wore the same socks until they shredded. If you were lucky, your shoes aired out by the fire. If not, they became something between garment and compost. You pass a young girl sitting cross-legged on a low wall. Her feet are bare, scrubbed red from the nearby stream. She's humming softly, trimming her nails with a shard of pottery. Simple self-care. A reminder that even in a world of general grime, people still tried. But still, the smells linger. Historians still argue about just how bad it really was. Some point to travelers' journals that describe great filth and stench in towns. Others suggest exaggeration. After all, those were often written by nobles or clergy who bathed more frequently. And let's not forget the poetic flair of medieval scribes. If something didn't reek of hellfire, was it even worth describing? There's also the question of foot powders, an early attempt at deodorant. Crushed chalk, burnt bone, even powdered dried flowers were sprinkled into socks or directly onto the feet. One recipe included ashes of vine root and flour of wheat. Another, more ambitious one, called for ground antler, vinegar, and the tears of a fasting woman. That last one might not have made it into mass production. You duck into a small chapel, where a cluster of pilgrims kneel in prayer. Their feet are wrapped in strips of cloth, the smell of travel wafting off them like incense's bitter cousin. They've walked for days, maybe weeks, hoping for healing. Blisters peek through their bindings. Some shoes have broken entirely. But they've carried on. In the corner, a basin sits filled with water. A sign above it reads, "For washing of feet before prayer." It's murky, rimmed with soap scum, and likely hasn't been changed since sunrise. But still, it's here. A pause. A chance. An echo of care in a world that had little time for comfort. You step out again into the sun, your own feet imaginary, but tingling all the same. You can feel the ghost of medieval boots, the itch of damp wool, the scent of every mile you've walked in your mind. And you realize something quietly humbling: in a world where nearly everything smelled bad, people still reached for roses. You follow the winding path out of town and into a quieter quarter, a cluster of crooked buildings huddled against a small stone wall. Signs hang low from beams, a crescent moon for a night-dwelling apothecary, a coiled bootlace for a cordwainer's shop, and, there, a small painted boot above a doorway, flanked by two crooked candles. You found the shoemaker's guild hall. Cobblers worked everywhere, but guilds controlled who was allowed to work professionally. And within these groups, often small, sometimes secretive, lay a whole world of rules, rivalries, and leather-related drama. You nudge the door open and step into a low-lit room that smells like tallow, smoke, and warm hide. Inside, a circle of men sits around a long table. One is sketching a pattern into waxed linen. Another is sharpening his awl with careful strokes, and a third is hunched over a small shoe, muttering oaths in Latin, or something close to Latin. In the corner, a boy dozes next to a pile of leather scraps. This is not your neighborhood cobbler. This is where shoemakers, real ones, train, argue, and complain about how the tanners never cure anything properly anymore. Guild life in medieval Europe was part craftsmanship, part politics. To join, you had to be an apprentice first, 7 years, minimum. You cleaned, fetched, polished, stitched, and maybe got to make a pair of shoelaces by year 4. Then, you graduated to journeyman. Only after producing a masterpiece, yes, that's the actual term, judged by senior members could you become a master shoemaker. The stakes were real. No guild membership. No shop. No tools. Possibly prison, if you tried to sell unauthorized shoes. Some cities enforced it harshly. Others turned a blind eye, unless you started cutting into profits. You wander deeper inside. Shelves hold rows of wooden lasts, each shaped for a different customer. Some are labeled with names, Sir Geoffrey, Widow and Father Nolan. Others are marked only with numbers or faded initials. These feet are preserved in wood, frozen in the act of stepping into a new century. On the wall, a large chart details pricing regulations, how much for a basic pair, extra for dyed leather, a surcharge if the customer has distempered feet, whatever that means. One marginal note reads, no boots for clergymen during Lent. Curious. Historians still debate whether this was a religious rule or just a protest against late payments. A man enters through the back door, holding what appears to be a corpse's shoe. You weren't expecting that. But yes, it was disturbingly common for cobblers to reclaim shoes from the dead, especially if the family didn't claim the body, or the boots were unusually well made. Footwear was valuable, and the dead weren't walking. You glance at the shoe. It's still damp, the lace is frayed, the leather cracked with signs of hard travel. No doubt it will be cleaned, restitched, and resold, then passed on to someone else. Nothing was wasted. Everything walked again. Guilds also faced internal feuds. Disputes over materials. Over territory. Over whether to allow women into the trade, some did, often widows of cobblers. One infamous case from 14th century Cologne involves two rival shoemakers who ended up dueling in the street, with awls. Both survived. Barely. You pass a small side room filled with paperwork, well, parchment. Ledgers, guild records, shoe inventories. A meticulous list from 1392 catalogs, pairs made for the bishop's retinue, in black hide and green stitch, for Easter procession. Another note, less formal, reads, if Thomas steals my wax again, I will punch him with my mallet. A timeless sentiment. There's a deeply human feel to the space. These were not just craftsmen, they were part of the city's structure. A good shoemaker could mean warm feet through winter. A bad one? A trip to the leech and 3 lost toes. Some guilds even performed public charity. Supplying shoes for orphans, beggars, or pilgrims passing through town. It was good for reputation, and possibly good for business. After all, someone had to shoe the barefoot faithful. In wealthier guilds, meetings involved wine, food, and elaborate rituals. You had to swear loyalty on a sacred tool, often an awl or hammer. Some kept relics, St. Crispin's bone fragments, yes, really, scraps of holy hide, or candles shaped like boots. The line between superstition and branding blurred beautifully. One fringe tradition claimed cobblers shouldn't work on Thursdays, because St. Crispin disapproved of noisy tools before Friday prayers. This was widely ignored. You pause beside a wall rack where several odd shoes hang. One is unusually long. One is impossibly small. One is made entirely of bark. A teaching set, maybe. Or just failed experiments. Either way, they radiate the trial and error life of the craft. Historians still argue whether medieval guilds helped preserve standards or simply crushed innovation. Some say they protected artisans. Others say they stifled change. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between stitches. The master shoemaker finally looks up. He nods at you, then returns to his work without a word. It's understood, if you stay long enough, they'll put you to work. Everyone starts by trimming soles. You slip back outside, the air suddenly feeling colder without the warm fug of tallow and glue. Behind you, hammers tap again, softly, steadily. Another pair of shoes is coming to life. Another journey beginning on someone else's feet. Because in the medieval world, shoes weren't just footwear. They were trust. Protection. A trace of dignity in a hard, muddy life. And behind every one of them was a cobbler, bent over his bench, stitching your survival one seam at a time. The sun has begun to dip, casting long shadows across the cobbled road as you wander toward the edge of town, where bells toll faintly in the distance and soft chanting drifts through a hedge of tall rosemary. You found yourself near a monastery, its stone walls thick with moss, its archways modest and bare. Here, the air is cooler, calmer. Even the dirt underfoot feels less rude. You step through the open gate. A novice greets you silently with a nod, then returns to sweeping, barefoot. And not just because he lost his sandals. This is deliberate. Monastic life, especially among the more ascetic orders, valued simplicity in all things, feet included. The clergy had a complicated relationship with shoes. On the one hand, humility meant embracing discomfort. On the other, nobody liked frostbite. So across Europe, monks and friars developed a range of footwear that balanced their vows with their toes. You enter the cloister garden where several monks walk slowly, prayer beads in hand. Their shoes are plain, soft leather or wood-soled sandals bound with strips of cloth. Some wear only woolen foot wraps tied with twine, and more than one is simply barefoot, even in the chill evening breeze. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century but still followed in many orders, was famously vague on footwear. Monks should be clothed according to local custom, including shoes, as needed. That ambiguity left room for interpretation. Some abbots banned shoes altogether. Others permitted sandals, especially in colder climates. You sit on a worn stone bench, watching a monk adjust his ankle straps. The sandals are crude, stitched from scraps, soles slightly warped, but he ties them with care. These aren't about fashion. They're about function, discipline, and occasionally penance. Walking on cold flagstones barefoot was its own form of meditation. Interestingly, the type of shoe a monk wore could reveal his order. Franciscans, known for radical poverty, often went barefoot entirely. Benedictines might wear sandals. Cistercians kept things practical. And bishops? Well, that was another story. Clergy with higher status, bishops, abbots, even the pope, often wore elaborately decorated shoes. Silk, velvet, red leather dyed with rare insects, and golden embroidery weren't unusual. A bishop's ceremonial shoe might be worth more than an entire village's harvest. But outside of high mass or processions, they too donned the same plain sandals. At least, in theory. You peek into the chapel, where an older monk kneels in prayer. At the altar, his shoes are removed. Bare feet on cool stone, a symbol of humility before God. There's a reverence to the gesture, repeated thousands of times across the centuries. Historians still debate the true intentions behind clergy footwear rules. Were they acts of sacrifice? Or just another layer of hierarchy? After all, some monks were given better sandals than others. Some got new shoes each year. Others patched theirs until they dissolved. A quirky fact emerges from a 14th century account. In one English abbey, the sandals of senior monks were lined with rabbit fur, secretly. Outwardly, they appeared humble. Inwardly, toasty. Whether this was sin or ingenuity depends on your perspective, and your toes. You walk past the dormitory. Rows of beds line the walls, each with a simple chest below. Inside, the only personal belongings, a robe, a book, maybe a rosary, and always, a pair of shoes. Some wrapped in cloth. Some hung on pegs. And one pair, you notice, missing entirely. Maybe being aired outside, or maybe returned to the earth with their owner. Death was no exception to the barefoot rule. Many monks were buried without shoes, symbolizing their return to dust without pretense. Yet in some traditions, ceremonial slippers were placed on the dead, soft, stitched from linen or even silk, meant to carry them quietly into heaven. Outside again, a novice oils his sandals with a mixture of beeswax and vinegar. He winces at the smell but rubs it in carefully. It'll keep the leather soft, waterproofed. He glances at you, shrugs. Better than goat urine, he mutters. You nod solemnly. You wander into the scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts with slow, deliberate strokes. Their sandals rest quietly on worn wooden floors, their feet shifting now and then to ease pressure. One has tucked a piece of folded cloth under his heel, an improvised insole. You file that away in your mental list of medieval hacks. One manuscript on the desk shows an illuminated figure, barefoot, haloed, walking over thorns. Likely Saint Francis, who famously abandoned shoes along with wealth. Below the image, a faint annotation in Latin, Beatus est, ca ambulat sine superbia. Blessed is he who walks without pride. Humble words for humble souls. And yet, it wasn't all solemnity. Feast days allowed for better shoes, sometimes dyed or embroidered. Monks would wear their Sunday best, still modest, but well crafted. It was a way of honoring the day, and perhaps their own aching arches. You pause under a stone arch as bells begin to ring. Vespers. A line of monks files past, the rhythm of sandals on stone soft and steady. No polanes, no polished buckles, just simple shoes worn with devotion. And as you watch them disappear into the twilight shadows of the chapel, you feel something unexpected. Peace. In a world obsessed with fashion, flash, and foot pain, there's something deeply calming about a row of sandals quietly doing their job. They weren't glamorous. They weren't even always comfortable. But these monastic shoes carried prayers, burdens, silence. And they left footprints not just on floors, but across centuries. You follow the monastery path back toward the village, the quiet stillness of prayer giving way to the light bustle of evening, clattering pans, distant laughter, the creak of carts rolling home. And just ahead, under the slanted roof of a timbered house, a woman adjusts her headdress and slips on a pair of shoes that seem too delicate for this uneven road. You've entered a different realm now, the world of medieval women's footwear, where fashion, function, and societal judgment wove together with threads tighter than any shoelace. At first glance, her shoes look practical, low-cut leather, tied with a strap over the arch. But look closer. The toes are lightly pointed, the stitching unusually fine, and the leather dyed a subtle green. Not garish. Not loud. But enough to say, I care what people think. Because for women in the medieval world, shoes were never just shoes. They were statements. Markers of class. Signals of modesty, or scandal. As you stroll past a row of townhouses, you see more examples. A young woman tending geese wears ankle boots with wooden soles, likely to keep her feet above the muck. Nearby, a merchant's wife steps gingerly over a puddle in soft indoor slippers, the kind meant for tiled floors, not pig paths. She curses quietly under her breath and hikes her skirt higher. And that, right there, is the rub. Women's shoes didn't exist in isolation, they were tied to rules about clothing, about modesty, about how much foot was too much foot. In many towns, showing your ankles was considered provocative. Some laws even dictated that a woman's shoe must cover the top of the foot completely. No instep, no toe cleavage. We wouldn't want the bakers distracted. Sumptuary laws again rear their puritanical heads. One decree in 14th century France banned women of the merchant class from wearing shoes dyed in more than one color. Another in Milan stated that only noblewomen could wear shoes lined with squirrel. Imagine being fined for cozy toes. Historians still argue whether these rules were widely enforced or mostly symbolic. Likely both. Records show that violations were sometimes punished with public shaming, especially during religious festivals. In a world where the line between vanity and vice was razor thin, women's footwear walked it daily. You duck into a small shop where a mother is helping her daughter try on new shoes. The girl grins as her toes slip into the soft wool lining. The shoes are simple, stitched felt over a leather sole, but the moment feels special. The girl spins, just once, clearly imagining a feast day, or perhaps a wedding. Women often received shoes as gifts, tokens of affection or status. Love letters sometimes mentioned foot size, poetically or otherwise. And shoes even played roles in marriage rituals. In parts of Scandinavia, it was customary for a bride to receive a pair of new shoes from her groom's family, symbolizing her new path. In England, one late custom involved throwing an old shoe at the departing bride, presumably for luck or perhaps just for sport. You pass a spinning yard where a group of women sit in a circle, their feet tucked beneath layered skirts. One pulls off her shoe, soft, slipper-like, and begins darning a hole in the toe with a bone needle. It's not the first time that shoe has needed fixing, and it won't be the last. Darning was part of life, a quiet act of care. Nearby, a grandmother recounts a story to a toddler, pointing to her own shoes, tiny now from shrinkage, warped from years of wear. You wonder how many winters those shoes endured, how many markets they trudged through, how many secrets they stepped over quietly. Not all women's shoes were soft, of course. Working women wore hard soles, hobnailed if they could afford them. Alewives, laundresses, and fieldworkers needed durability. Their shoes were often handed down or traded at markets, used, patched, and barely holding together. You come across a record from a tailor's ledger, 2 pairs of women's boots, one for the baker's wife, with thicker heel, to endure the oven floor. Practical customization, medieval edition. A quirky fashion trend emerges from some 15th century Italian paintings, women wearing pattens, wooden platforms strapped over their regular shoes to keep hems clean. Some were so high they required assistance to walk. They were absurd and oddly beautiful, clopping loudly on marble floors. A Venetian chronicler grumbled that pattens made it impossible to hear mass, for the clicking of women's footsteps. Of course, in private, many women went barefoot. In the home, in gardens, in the spaces not governed by public scrutiny, the shoes came off. There are diary entries and letters that mention the joy of bare feet in summer grass, or the shame of being caught barefoot by an unexpected visitor. One such letter, from a noblewoman to her sister, reads, "I was without shoes when the bishop arrived, I nearly died of embarrassment, though he seemed amused." Shoes also bore emotional weight. A widow might keep her husband's shoes by the hearth long after his death. A woman might tuck herbs into her slippers before travel, hoping for safe passage. In a world without GPS or padded insoles, shoes became charms, memories, prayers stitched into soles. Historians often overlook women's footwear, focusing instead on dramatic men's fashion, those preposterous polanes and jeweled boots. But here, in the soft curve of a pointed toe, in the careful choice of dye, in the stitched repairs passed from hand to hand, you see something quietly powerful. These shoes didn't shout. They whispered. Of modesty. Of movement. Of lives lived between walls and fields, between judgment and freedom. And as you walk on, imagining the women who wore them, brides, beggars, mothers, saints, you begin to see each footprint not as a fashion statement, but as a story. You take a turn down a dusty side lane that opens into a small schoolyard, just a single wooden building with slanted walls and smoke curling from its chimney. A group of children bursts out the door, their laughter echoing off the walls as they scatter like birds. Some race barefoot over the gravel. Others hop awkwardly, their shoes missing or half falling off. A few tug at sandals patched so many times they now resemble a kind of laced-up puzzle. Children's footwear in medieval Europe was complicated. Most didn't have any. The expense of crafting shoes for growing feet, feet that might outgrow a pair in months, meant most children went barefoot, except in deep winter or for holy days. Even noble children often wore slippers only inside. Outside, their small toes braved the same muddy paths and splintery boards as the adults, just lower to the ground and more likely to find every sharp object. You step closer to the building. A tiny pair of shoes sits outside the door, one upright, one toppled over. They're turn shoes, soft leather stitched inside out, just like their adult versions, but clearly made smaller, and more hastily. The seams are crooked. The left shoe is slightly longer than the right. But they did the job, for now. Inside, the schoolmaster drones on about Latin declensions while one student absently picks at a cracked leather strap dangling from her shoe. The toe is open, her big toenail peeking out like it's trying to escape. You know that shoe has been worn by at least 3 older siblings, and likely will move on to 1 or 2 more, held together by luck, knots, and the occasional prayer. Historians still debate whether child shoemakers existed as a specific trade or whether children's shoes were simply made by apprentices learning their craft. Evidence leans toward the latter. Making tiny shoes was excellent practice. If you could stitch something no longer than a turnip, you were well on your way to making a knight's boots. That didn't mean they turned out well. And here's something delightfully grim: many of the child-sized shoes archaeologists find from the period are not symmetrical. They lack heels, they lack soles, and sometimes they lack logic. One museum curator once described a child's shoe from 13th century York as little more than a sock made of regret. Outside again, you watch 2 boys wrestling near a well. One wears one shoe. Just one. The other hops away laughing with the matching mate in his hand. It's hard to say whether this is a prank, a fight, or just daily life. But you do know that mismatched shoes weren't rare. In fact, many children wore whatever was available: left foot, right foot, no distinction, no complaints. A scrap of writing from a Flemish merchant's diary mentions a boy with shoes of 2 kinds, one green and one brown, both unfit for rain. It's likely the child's family had scavenged both from a charity pile or abandoned property. Charities and churches occasionally distributed shoes to children, especially in colder regions. These were often crude, mass-produced by monastic workers or shoemaker guilds during holy seasons. Most were made from thick leather with a single seam and closed with toggles. A pair might last a season. If it didn't, you made do with wrappings, straw, or nothing at all. You pass a small home where a mother sits cross-legged, sewing a patch into the side of a toddler's shoe. She's humming softly. The child watches, sucking on a button. The patch is made from the worn cuff of a cloak, recycling in action. That shoe will survive another 2 weeks, maybe 3. A quirky little tradition. Some families traced children's feet onto parchment and sent the cutouts to cobblers for sizing. Not unlike today's mail-order insoles. It was especially common among nobles who commissioned first shoes, ceremonial slippers gifted on feast days or birthdays. Some were embroidered with the child's initials, others with charms stitched inside to ward off sickness. Sadly, they were rarely worn more than once. Often preserved, sometimes buried with the child. Speaking of burial, archaeologists have uncovered grave sites where children were buried with their shoes tucked under their heads like pillows. Historians still argue the meaning: was it symbolic of comfort, a journey to the afterlife, or just the safest place to store a precious item? No one knows. But the image lingers. You step around the schoolyard again. A girl with a wild braid is chasing a goat, her shoes flapping noisily with each step. They're too big, clearly made for someone older, and are held on by 2 loops of twine and sheer determination. She doesn't care. She's faster than the goat, and that's what matters. In wealthier households, child footwear could be fancy. Silk slippers for indoor play. Velvet boots for public appearances. Some were even encrusted with tiny bells so you could hear your noble child toddling away, whether in joy or mischief. But these were rare, expensive, and largely impractical. Most were kept clean in chests and never saw a muddy road. Even royal children weren't immune to foot pain. Letters from court physicians mention ointments for growth pain, swellings of the feet, and recommendations for shoes of gentler stitch. Translation: someone's prince got a blister. You reach a stone bench where several children rest. One has removed his shoes and is poking at a beetle with a stick. The shoes lie beside him, toe seams burst open, soles worn almost to nothing. You can see how the leather has curled back, revealing the patchwork stuffing inside, straw, moss, and, yes, an old linen rag. But still, they are shoes. They are proof of care. Of effort. Of someone trying to protect small feet from sharp stones and freezing earth. And somehow, despite the cold, the patching, the blisters, the missing laces, these kids run, climb, stomp, play. Their shoes flop. Their toes peek out. And their laughter fills the street. Because childhood, even in a world of hardship, still finds ways to sprint joyfully forward, one mismatched, half-patched shoe at a time. The air is cooler now as the sun dips lower, and you find yourself following a winding path away from the village and toward the open countryside. The road here is uneven, flanked by hedgerows and scattered with pebbles and puddles. But you're not alone. Figures pass you, slow-moving, wrapped in cloaks, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of travel and time. You're among pilgrims now. They come in all shapes and states, young, old, limping, hardy. Some carry staffs, others tiny wooden crosses. But all of them share something in common: tired feet. Very, very tired feet. Pilgrimage was central to medieval life. People traveled for penance, for healing, for hope. And while the holy sites varied, from Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela, the method was always the same: walk. Miles upon miles. Day after day. Through rain, through blistering heat, over hills, into valleys. Sometimes barefoot. Sometimes in sandals. Sometimes with the saddest, most abused pair of shoes you've ever seen. You pass a man seated on a mossy stone, peeling a sock, well, a former sock, off his foot. The skin beneath is angry red, cracked, with what looks like the beginning of something unpleasant between the toes. He winces, reaches into his satchel, and pulls out a bundle of herbs. A medieval foot spa, right here on the roadside. Pilgrims prepared for their journey as best they could. That often meant acquiring a pair of sturdy shoes, if they could afford them. Some even made their own. But most relied on hand-me-downs or the goodwill of their parish. One church record from 1420 mentions the distribution of 10 pairs of sturdy boots, for patched sandals, and 6 woolen wrappings for the poor traveling to the shrine. Yet even the best footwear couldn't withstand hundreds of miles. Shoes wore out. Soles cracked. Straps snapped. So pilgrims patched, stuffed, and tied them back together with whatever was available: twine, thread, strips of cloth, or even dried grass. One quirky tactic involved wetting leather shoes at night and placing them under a stone. The weight was meant to reshape the shoe and flatten curled edges. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe it just made things wetter in the morning. Historians still argue whether pilgrims truly walked barefoot out of devotion or desperation. Certainly, some did it willingly, as an act of penance. Others may have simply lost their shoes along the way, or never had them to begin with. Either way, medieval roads did not care. Mud didn't care. Nor did thorns, rocks, or the occasional hostile goat. You glance at a woman leaning against a tree, massaging her ankle. Her shoes dangle from her fingers, damp and clearly too small. She notices your look and smiles tiredly. "I traded bread for these," she might say, but they were made for a smaller saint. Pilgrimage wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey. And the journey often hurt. Feet blistered, arches collapsed, ankles swelled. Records from infirmaries near major shrines describe pilgrim foot, a term used for infections caused by long walking and poor footwear. Remedies included soaking feet in wine, wrapping them in linen soaked with sage and vinegar, or, failing all else, amputation. You enter a small hamlet near a crossroads where a group of pilgrims has set up camp. One is airing out his boots over a fire. Another is applying honey to a cracked heel. Honey was believed to draw out infection. You'd be surprised how often it helped. Nearby, a friar trims away the ragged edge of a pilgrim's sandal with a curved blade. He works slowly, muttering blessings, or possibly complaints, under his breath. His own feet are bare, covered in calluses like armor. You imagine he's walked this path many times. In the center of the group sits an old woman, cross-legged, her feet bandaged in strips of dyed cloth. She's telling a story about a miracle spring and a vision of St. James. No one interrupts her. Not even the dog gnawing on someone's leftover shoe strap. And then there's the pilgrim badge, the little metal emblem worn on a cloak or hat, proof of the journey completed. Many pilgrims saved them, treasured them, and stitched them into their next pair of shoes for protection. A badge on your foot meant you'd walked with purpose once. It also meant, practically, that you'd been somewhere. That you'd made it back. Interestingly, cobblers near pilgrimage sites often specialized in emergency repairs. Some even sold one-use shoes, thin, pre-patched, designed to last exactly as long as needed. Pilgrim pop-ups, centuries before pop-up shops became a thing. You continue walking, passing shrines by the road, simple stone markers, sometimes just a carved cross. Beneath one, a pair of shoes sits quietly. They're small, child-sized, the leather stiff with rain. Were they left as a prayer? An offering? A tribute? Historians still puzzle over such finds. Another shrine displays a foot carved in wood. A votive symbol. You're reminded that medieval people didn't just walk with their feet, they worshipped with them. Pilgrimage was a bodily act of devotion, suffering included. You reach a ridge, the sky blazing orange as the sun begins to drop. Ahead, in the distance, a group of pilgrims crests a hill. Their silhouettes are lopsided, limping, bent, but still moving. Shoes dragging, socks falling, feet aching, but still moving. And in that quiet moment, you realize the most profound thing about shoes on pilgrimage: they may wear out, fall apart, or vanish altogether, but somehow, the people inside them keep going. You follow the trail back toward the village outskirts, your steps now measured and a little weary. The roads have shifted again, no longer packed dirt or open fields, but cobbled stone laid out with care, the kind of surface that's both a blessing and a curse depending on how much leather you've got between you and it. Your feet start to ache again, imaginatively or otherwise, and you find yourself thinking, at least modern shoes know which foot is which. Because for a long time, longer than you'd think, medieval shoes did not. There were no lefts and rights. Not really. Just shoes. Symmetrical, neutral, and deeply unbothered by your arches. The unilateral shoe, as some historians now call it, was the default for centuries. Most medieval footwear, from peasant clogs to noble boots, was made on a straight last, a flat, foot-shaped wooden mold with no distinction between left and right. You wore them until your foot did the work. After a few weeks of hobbling, one shoe would start to favor one side. The leather would crease, bulge, stretch, and, eventually, submit. That's not to say people liked it. You pass an elderly man sitting in the shade, his shoe in his lap, poking at it with what looks like a fish bone. He's trying to dig out a pebble lodged deep in the sole's fold. The shoe is clearly right-footed now, bent and curled inward, but it didn't start that way. No shoe did. Historians still argue when left-right distinction became common. Some point to 16th century Germany as the tipping point. Others trace it to earlier examples in Italy or Spain, where cobblers with access to better tools and techniques experimented with shaped soles. But for most of the medieval period, your shoes were ambidextrous, whether your feet liked it or not. You duck into a narrow shop marked by a sign with two mirrored shoes, clearly an artisan with opinions. Inside, a middle-aged cobbler lays out two soles on his workbench. You notice immediately, one curves slightly to the left. The other to the right. He's ahead of his time. Some folks are willing to pay extra, he mutters, not looking up. But most, they just wear it in. He explains that shaping shoes takes longer. More measuring. More cutting. You need separate lasts for left and right, and they don't come cheap. And then, of course, there's the customer's expectations. If the left fits better than the right, they'll assume something's wrong. If both fit badly, they'll assume you're wrong. You nod sympathetically, as if you, too, have suffered complaints about medieval foot ergonomics. The cobbler shows you a pair he's made for a merchant with fussy bones. They're padded on the inside, slightly flared at the toe. You almost want to try them on. But they're spoken for, and besides, you've got imaginary pilgrim feet to tend to. You continue down the lane, reflecting on just how long the world tolerated symmetrical shoes. It wasn't just Europe. Roman sandals were ambidextrous. Ancient Egyptian slippers. Same. It turns out that the idea of making a shoe that fits the natural contour of a human foot was, somehow revolutionary. Even noble shoes followed the straight-lasted rule. Those curly-toed polanes you saw earlier? Perfectly identical on both feet. It didn't matter if your left foot was half a size wider or if your right pinky toe always took the brunt of the blistering. Fashion dictated uniformity. And for peasants? Forget it. They were lucky to have shoes, much less matching ones. Many simply wore the same shoe on either foot, swapping them around to distribute wear. That may have helped prevent early creasing, but it also meant there was no true breaking in. Just breaking down. You pass a young boy with one shoe far more worn than the other. He walks with a subtle tilt, like someone perpetually bracing against a strong wind. His mother notices and hands him a bundle of straw. He stuffs it into the worst shoe, visibly relieved. Medieval orthotics at their finest. A fringe tradition recorded in parts of Wales mentions using sheep's wool on one side of the foot to guide the shoe into favoring a left or right shape. It's unclear whether this was based on comfort or folklore, but the implication was clear: if the shoe doesn't fit, cheat. You step into a small chapel and find a row of shoes near the entrance. Pilgrims again. You glance over the pairs, none seem to match. Not just left and right, but each other. Different leathers. Different soles. All warped into distinct foot-shaped sculptures. Each one a biography in hide. One pilgrim stands barefoot at the altar, his shoes drying by the door. You notice his right foot has a heavy callus across the outer edge, where his straight-lasted shoe never quite adjusted. But he's smiling. Maybe he made peace with the imbalance. Maybe he doesn't feel it anymore. Modern eyes might see the lack of left-right shoes as a flaw. But in the medieval world, it was just how things were. Shoes didn't fit you, you fit into them. Or didn't. Either way, you walked. And as you step back onto the road, you can feel it now, that slow, insistent ache in the ball of your foot. The imaginary blister where the leather rubs. The slight tilt in your step that suggests you've been wearing the same symmetrical shoes for a week. It's strangely comforting. Because you're not alone. For centuries, millions walked this way, equal parts pain and progress, their soles slowly molding their world into shape. One blister at a time. The air has turned damp and heavy as twilight settles over the hills. A chill creeps in from the north, sneaking beneath cloaks and through the cracks in old boots. You wrap your arms tighter across your chest, not just from cold, but in sympathy for the thousands who once faced nights like this with nothing more than soggy wool around their feet. You've entered winter now. And winter, in the medieval world, was brutal, especially for your feet. Imagine waking up in a drafty hut, your shoes stiff with frost, your socks, if you had them, still wet from yesterday's trudge through melting snow. There's no fire yet. No central heating. Just your breath, your shivers, and the terrible knowledge that you must go out again. You shuffle past a family loading wood onto a cart. The youngest child's boots are so worn you can see her toes. She smiles anyway, too used to discomfort to register it as a problem. Her socks. Probably wool. Probably homemade. Possibly moss. Yes, moss. Historians have recorded all kinds of desperate attempts at foot insulation. Moss, straw, animal hair, even feathers stuffed into foot wraps. In Scandinavia and northern Britain, people lined their shoes with dried grass or shredded bark. It wasn't comfortable. But it was better than nothing. You glance at a man repairing his boot by firelight. He's sewing the sole with stiff hands, muttering as he goes. Only needs to last till spring, he says, though it clearly won't. His socks are drying beside the flames, loose, thick, pilled. Someone once tried to dye them blue, but time and cold have turned them a sort of miserable gray. And the smell? Damp wool and scorched leather. A seasonal perfume. A quirky tip from a 14th century herbal recommends placing hot stones in your shoes before putting them on, just for a moment, to warm the leather. People also wore foot stones, small heated rocks wrapped in cloth, tucked near their ankles under their hose. Brief warmth, quickly gone. You walk past a blacksmith's forge, where workers pause to stomp their feet. Sparks rain around their boots. The smith himself wears thick-soled clogs, layered with a strip of wool nailed between the wood and leather. It's noisy, impractical, but warm. Some monasteries, particularly in colder regions, issued winter hose, long, tightly woven woolen tubes that reached the thigh and doubled as leg insulation. Worn with boots, they helped. Worn without. You just looked like an itchy sausage waiting to freeze. Historians still argue over the quality of medieval socks. Were they finely knit for the wealthy? Sure. Were they comfortable? Not necessarily. Were they widely available for the poor? Hardly. One peasant inventory from Yorkshire lists, 2 winter wrappings, coarse spun. No hose. Which means some folks used only wrapped rags, even in snow. You pass a field where a shepherd tends to his flock. His boots are laced up with rawhide, but you can see the frost on his toes through a hole. He's standing in straw. That's not accidental. Straw was insulation. It was bedding. And when stuffed into shoes, it added another layer between skin and suffering. Another shepherd's trick, layering. A sock, then moss, then a second sock, or a piece of linen tied over the top. The layering wasn't pretty. But it worked, at least for a while. Until the moisture crept in. And it always did. You see a child trudging past with what looks like a bundle of rags tied around each foot. She leaves a strange trail behind, more dragging than stepping. You wonder if those rags were once clothes, now demoted to foot duty. That kind of recycling wasn't rare. In fact, it was expected. A 15th century letter describes a woman who wrapped her feet in pages from an old psalter before stepping into her shoes. Sacred texts for sacred toes. Possibly. Or maybe just the only dry paper left in the house. There were remedies for frozen feet, too. Foot baths of warmed ale mixed with rosemary. Foot massage with goose grease. One physician swore by urine soaks. No thanks. You duck into a wayside tavern where a fire burns low. Travelers huddle close, boots steaming. One removes a pair of socks, revealing layers of straw underneath. Another peels off foot wraps so damp they seem to melt in his hands. Someone curses quietly and sets their shoes near the hearth. The leather smokes. Above the fire hangs a drying rack filled with footwear. Turn shoes, clogs, woolen boots, even pattens with ice clinging to the underside. It's a sad collection of survival. Every pair has been soaked through and stitched again. You overhear a tale, a man who froze both feet during a storm near York. They turned black. He walked on them anyway. For 2 more days, someone says, before he sat down and never got up again. A silence follows. Then a shrug. That's winter. You step back outside. The wind bites harder now, your imaginary toes curling in protest. You can almost feel the crunch of ice inside your soul, the numb ache spreading up your heel. But the stars are out. Above you, the cold sky glitters. And below, people still walk. Slowly. Tenderly. Wrapped in straw and wool and hope. Because even in the deepest cold, life moved forward. Feet found paths. And the people inside them kept walking, moss-filled shoes and all, toward spring. You leave the frozen fields behind and duck into a narrow alleyway between two tall timbered houses. It's darker here, and quieter, and your footsteps seem to echo against the damp stones. But even in this enclosed space, the air carries a familiar note, a sharp, sour undertone that hits your nose with certainty. Foot odor. Again. In medieval Europe, bad smells were constant companions, but the feet had a particular reputation. Trapped in shoes with no ventilation, marinating in woolen hose, marching through filth, and rarely, washed, they became little mobile ecosystems. And not the cute, forested kind. You find yourself near a small open-air market. A woman has a stall set up with herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, and lavender. But what catches your attention is a bowl of white powder, chalk, she says. For shoes, she adds with a wink. And for husbands. Medieval folk knew feet could get ripe. They didn't have our germ theory, but they had noses. And so, remedies abounded. Foot powders, herbal washes, scented oils, some useful, some hopeful, some just, strange. You pass a bench where a man is rubbing crushed mint leaves onto the soles of his feet. He grimaces. Burns a bit, he mutters. Means it's working. Maybe. Or maybe it's just mint and medieval optimism. A popular blend for soaking feet included wine, vinegar, and salt. If you were lucky, someone might toss in sage or marjoram. If you were unlucky, it might include ox gall, yes, bile. Bitter and antibacterial, though more in theory than in smell. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these concoctions. Some may have genuinely reduced odor and infection. Others were ritualistic, repeated because someone's grandmother swore by them. And some, like the infamous foot balm of ground lark tongue mixed with lard, were best left untested. You round the corner into a bathhouse courtyard. A large wooden tub steams gently under an awning. A sign reads, "Feet only." No full bathing. Inside, two men soak their feet, heads tilted back, shoes drying nearby. The water has turned a murky gray. It wasn't uncommon for bathhouses to offer foot baths as standalone services. Even in towns with poor hygiene, washing the feet had practical and social appeal. And not just for comfort, some believed that dirty feet led to disease, starting from the bottom up. Nearby, a young woman wrings out a cloth soaked in rosewater and rubs it between her toes. Her sandals are lined with linen and faintly scented. She glances your way. "For the market," she says. "I don't want to be remembered by smell." You pass another alley where shoes are drying, upside down, leather dark and cracking. Inside one pair is a wad of something lumpy. You lean closer. Crushed herbs mixed with clay. Likely intended to deodorize and reshape. It might help, or it might just harden into something a rat could chew. A fringe remedy comes to mind, described in a German text as foot fumigation. Yes, medieval people smoked out their shoes. Burning rosemary, thyme, or pine resin inside the shoe to kill odors and, they hoped, demons. Possibly both. You stop at a small apothecary's window. Inside, a row of clay jars bears hand-lettered labels, for stink foot, soul balm, ointment of the archangel. A boy is grinding something with a pestle, maybe chalk, maybe dried sage. His master leans over and adds a splash of oil. The whole shop smells sharp, herbal, and faintly of cheese. A man enters, lifts one foot, and slaps it on the counter. The shopkeeper doesn't flinch. He applies a thin paste of greenish clay, says a prayer under his breath, and wraps the foot in linen. You wonder what part was medicinal, and what part was just for comfort. Then there's the medieval obsession with balance, the belief in bodily humors. Too much cold and wet in the feet. You were inviting melancholy. Warm and dry. Maybe rage. So the goal became balance. Not too cold, not too hot, not too smelly. Good luck with that in boots lined with sheepskin and gilt. Foot odor wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Monks washed feet as acts of humility. Pilgrims had theirs cleaned upon arrival. And in some noble households, guests were offered scented slippers. For comfort, yes, but also to keep the dinner table tolerable. You walk past a beggar asleep near a doorway, boots off, feet exposed. A woman places a sprig of lavender beside him and moves on. You're not sure if it's kindness, pity, or a gentle protest. Maybe all three. Even shoe construction began to change in response to smell. Ventilation holes, those pretty cutouts in leather uppers, were sometimes as much about odor as style. Some shoes included slits near the heel, allowing air to circulate. The more expensive the shoe, the more likely it breathed. But for most people, foot odor was simply a fact of life. You dealt with it. You masked it. You apologized with herbs and lard. You learned to live with it, as you did with so much else. And as you wander past another stall selling clove-stuffed sachets, you realize something oddly comforting: they tried. They didn't have sprays, insoles, powders in sleek plastic bottles. But they had mint, vinegar, chalk, and hope. They understood that feet get gross, and that sometimes, a little sage in your shoe can make the day just a bit more bearable. You wake before dawn now, your imaginary feet aching, the chill from last night still clinging to your socks, even though you don't technically have any. There's a soft drumming sound outside, not rain, but something heavier. Metal on earth. The rhythm of boots. You're following soldiers today. War didn't stop for blisters. The medieval battlefield was as brutal on your feet as it was on your nerves. Campaigns stretched for weeks, even months, across wet grass, dry fields, craggy hills, and swampy riverbanks. And while everyone remembers swords and armor, few think of what carried all that weight, the boots beneath it. You join a ragtag column of infantry. Their clothes are muddied, their weapons nicked, and their shoes, well, shoes might be too generous. Some wear high boots, others low-cut turnshoes laced tight. A few march in patched sandals stuffed with straw. And at least one soldier, limping badly, walks barefoot, one foot wrapped in bloodied cloth. He grits his teeth and keeps moving. Medieval military boots weren't standardized. There were no government-issued sizes. No padded insoles. Soldiers wore what they had, what they could scavenge, or what their commander could afford. That meant war boots varied wildly in quality, from fur-lined beauties worn by noble knights to slouching leather husks tied with scraps of cord. You pass a small field tent where a squire rubs beeswax into his knight's boots. The leather is cracked from water damage and pocked with dried mud. He works quickly, then wraps the boots in cloth to keep them dry until morning. In wet weather, even that small gesture might mean saving a foot from rot. And rot was real. A lot of marching meant a lot of wetness, snow, rain, river crossings, morning dew. When moisture lingered too long inside your boots, the result was what we'd now call trench foot, swelling, numbness, skin peeling away like old bark. No antibiotics. No rest. Just hobbling forward until someone noticed, or didn't. To prevent it, soldiers dried their boots over fires, stuffed them with straw, or hung them on their spears during camp. A quirky battlefield trick. Rubbing the inside of your boots with garlic. Not just for smell, but because garlic was believed to draw out poisons. Whether it helped or not, your fellow soldiers probably kept their distance. You reach a supply cart loaded with armor, food sacks, and shoes. Pairs of worn boots taken from fallen enemies. They're mismatched, blood-stained, and still warm from the last wearer's body. War is practical like that. If a boot fits, or almost fits, you wear it. And if it doesn't, you do anyway. Some medieval armies kept a cobbler or two on campaign, working from a mobile bench by torchlight. You pass one now, stitching a heel back onto a boot with deer sinew. He's working fast, someone's waiting for it. And he's using a borrowed awl, probably sharpened on a shield. You get the feeling it's not his first all-nighter. Historians still argue how effective medieval footwear was in battle. Some sources claim that the lack of ankle support led to frequent sprains. Others suggest soldiers bound their legs tightly with cloth to reinforce the joint, essentially homemade compression wraps. Either way, comfort wasn't the priority. Endurance was. And then there's the matter of hobnails. You spot them when one soldier props his feet by the fire, small metal studs embedded into the sole, like medieval cleats. Hobnails added traction, helped prevent the leather from wearing down too quickly, and made your boots sound intimidating on cobblestones. The downside? They made you slip like mad on wet stone and froze your feet in cold weather. But in a muddy field, they were gold. You pass a night adjusting his sabatons, metal foot armor strapped over leather boots. They clink as he moves. Heavy, awkward, beautiful. Sabatons protected against sword strikes, yes, but also crushed your toes if you tripped. Some were hinged, some were riveted, and all of them were nightmares in snow. But they made your enemies think twice. At the edge of camp, a pair of boots sits abandoned in the grass. One is missing a toe. The other is curled from fire damage. Nearby lies a broken bowstring and a helmet half buried in mud. You don't look too closely. War chews through everything, feet included. Later, during battle, you see it firsthand. Soldiers slipping on slick ground, stumbling over roots, boots sucked off in mud. A man loses his shoe mid-sprint and doesn't stop to retrieve it. Another kicks his broken boot off mid-fight and fights in one sock. A third, barefoot, eyes wild, charges across gravel, not feeling a thing. Not yet. After the clash, the battlefield is quiet, except for moans and the slow shuffling of survivors. Some crawl. Some walk with makeshift crutches. Others remove their boots and dump blood from them like water. You spot a soldier massaging his foot with a grimace. His heel is blistered, split. He pulls out a strip of linen, wraps it tightly, then shoves his foot back into a stiff, soaked boot. There's still a march ahead. And maybe the next town has a cobbler. Maybe not. But even here, between pain and duty, blood and grit, shoes remain vital. They're not just gear. They're lifelines. Carriers of weight, tools of war, containers of history. You walk on, the ghost of hobnails clicking beneath your steps, knowing that no armor, no blade, no battle cry matters much, if your feet can't hold you upright. You trudge slowly now, as if your own feet have begun to swell with imagined bruises. The road ahead widens, lined with shops and manor houses. Richer soil. Smoother stone. And just like that, you find yourself in the world of people who walked not just for survival, but for spectacle. Because in medieval Europe, shoes weren't always about protection. Sometimes, they were about status. You see it immediately. A nobleman strolls by, his robe trailing, his shoes so fine they look more like jewelry than footwear. Polished leather, dyed deep crimson, with little golden clasps and silk laces wrapped 3 times around the ankle. You don't need to ask his job. His shoes speak volumes. Wealth walked differently. Across the way, a lady descends from a cart, no mud, no dust, her feet landing lightly in velvet slippers that could never survive a morning in the fields. The soles are thin, almost ornamental, and probably stitched by hand in a Parisian workshop you'll never see. Even the servants bow. Sumptuary laws, the medieval attempt to regulate class through fashion, had a lot to say about shoes. In many cities, laws stated what kind of materials, dyes, decorations, and even toe length you could legally wear based on your rank. In England, the statutes of apparel under Edward IV limited shoe tips to 2 inches for commoners. Nobles could extend up to 6. Royalty? Well, their toes practically arrived before they did. You pass a tailor's shop with a display of shoes in the window. Some with turned-up toes, others with elaborate brocade. A small sign reads, "By license of the Lord Mayor." Not everyone could shop here. You had to deserve it. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced. Some towns issued fines. Others publicly shamed offenders. But fashion, as ever, found ways around the law. People dyed cheaper leather to mimic forbidden hues. They copied noble styles using rougher cloth. And cobblers who knew how to look the other way stayed in business. There's even a recorded case of a merchant in Florence fined for wearing ducal boots to impress a potential father-in-law. He paid the fine. The marriage went through anyway. You stop near a fountain where a group of pages unload a chest from a coach. The lid creaks open, revealing a dozen pairs of shoes wrapped in cloth. Different styles for different occasions: riding boots, dancing slippers, velvet court shoes with tiny mirrors sewn into the sides. Someone clearly planned to be seen. A fringe fashion. Shoes made of dyed fish skin. Not common, not cheap, and certainly not pleasant smelling, but the sheen was unlike any other leather. One 15th century poet described them as slippers of shimmering scale, fit for Neptune's court. You assume he never wore them in summer. Even within noble households, footwear varied by task. You peek into a manor kitchen where the cook wears soft clogs, the stablemaster sports ankle boots, and the tutor paces in worn felt shoes that were probably once white. All well-made, all functional, but none as decorative as the master's. In the dining hall, guests arrive wearing their finest shoes. Some remove them before sitting, common in upper-class circles where clean floors mattered more than foot privacy. Servants take the shoes and polish them discreetly nearby, sometimes perfuming them with crushed cloves or orris root. One particularly wealthy noblewoman was known to change her shoes 3 times a day: morning slippers, afternoon riding boots, and evening dinner shoes, encrusted with pearls. A monk who dined at her estate once described them as holier than mine, for they surely tread no dirt. You smile. Shoes became performance. But it wasn't just the nobles. The merchant class soon followed. A successful cloth dealer might wear embossed leather boots with brass buckles to show his growing wealth. A goldsmith's daughter might invest in red-dyed slippers, once forbidden, now flaunted. You watch a wedding procession go by. The bride wears white shoes, unusual for the time, embroidered with silver thread. She walks carefully, though not because she's shy. Because the shoes cost a fortune. And nearby, a shoemaker's son wearing his father's hand-me-downs, watching her with a mix of awe and dismay. Because for every step of beauty, there were 10 that went unnoticed. One fashion plate's glory was another cobbler's headache. Fancy shoes meant more work, more materials, more chances to get something wrong. A cobbler's margin of error shrank when shoes became status symbols. There's even a bitter letter from a guild member in Bruges complaining that wealthy clients care more for color than fit, and more for glimmer than good hide. You imagine him hunched over a workbench, fuming over a misaligned ribbon. Still, shoes marked social position like nothing else. They signaled wealth, gender, age, and sometimes even religious piety. Red shoes for cardinals. Bare feet for penance. Thick boots for trade. Thin slippers for seduction. And once again, you're reminded that feet weren't just tools. They were statements. What covered them? Even more so. So as you pass another noble striding down the road, silk shoes brushing stone, with guards trailing close behind, you realize he doesn't even glance at the ground. Because the real luxury wasn't just fine leather or golden buckles. It was knowing your feet would never touch mud again. Evening deepens now, and the sky takes on that faint medieval shade of soot and candle smoke. You follow the quiet curve of a cloister wall until it opens into a courtyard, still, wide, and oddly luminous under a rising moon. In the center stands a chapel with stained glass windows. And in those windows, feet. Yes, feet. Delicate, floating feet. Bare, glowing, saintly. Some bruised. Some pierced. One pair resting gently on a serpent. Another dangling mid-air, ascending toward heaven. You're not here to admire the windows, you're here to understand how medieval art saw feet. Because while shoes were worn, feet were shown. Feet carried spiritual symbolism in medieval iconography. Purity, humility, sin, penance, they all marched through the world on painted toes and sculpted arches. Inside the chapel, a mural runs the length of the wall. Christ washes his disciples' feet, bare, angular, oddly clean for a dusty age. The scene emphasizes service, humility. But it's also a social statement. To touch someone's foot was to acknowledge their burden. And to show your own foot? That meant vulnerability. You sit quietly as a monk sweeps past, the hem of his robe just grazing his sandals. His footfalls echo softly. You imagine how often this room has been filled not with silence, but with feet, pilgrims entering barefoot, nobles kneeling, monks pacing, penitents crawling. In another stained glass panel, Saint Roch lifts the hem of his robe to reveal a leg wound, and a small dog licking his bare foot. His shoes lie beside him, forgotten. The message is simple: pain, humanity, healing. And shoes were just props, temporary vessels in a longer story. You step outside and find yourself beside a cathedral facade carved with angels. One, improbably, is adjusting a sandal. Another has one foot forward, as if mid-step, the toes elongated in the strange, stylized way of Gothic sculpture. It's not anatomically correct, but it's emotionally specific. Historians still debate whether medieval artists avoided realistic feet out of modesty, skill limitations, or a desire to symbolize, not simulate. Probably all three. Feet were exaggerated, idealized, or reduced to abstract shapes. Because in art, the foot was never just a foot. A fringe theory even claims that overly long feet in medieval art signified the soul's journey, because to walk was to move closer to God. That might be poetic nonsense. But then again, you are in a courtyard surrounded by 6 dozen sculpted toes. You turn a corner and come upon an illustrated manuscript left open on a wooden stand. The page shows a peasant woman stomping grapes, barefoot, smiling, skirt lifted. Her feet are dirty, round, and expressive. The vines curl around her ankles. This isn't just agriculture, this is intimacy. Earth, foot, vine, all entwined. Marginalia, the little doodle scribbled in manuscript margins, loved feet. Monks illustrated wild scenes of bare feet kicking demons, wrestling with snails, or warming themselves at tiny drawn fires. Sometimes they're accurate. Sometimes they're just goofy. Either way, they're telling you something. The artist had spent a lot of time thinking about feet. And then, of course, there's the devil. You pass a wooden door, cracked slightly open. Inside, a fresco, the damned descend into hell, and several have clawed feet. Bestial, twisted, unclean. The shoe, after all, was a civilizing force. Lose that, and you risked becoming other. In some paintings, sinners are shown barefoot, chained, shivering. Their feet signify their fall, no longer protected, no longer divine. The arch collapses, the heel burns. A single toe twisted wrong could symbolize a lifetime of vice. On the opposite wall, saints float upward, their feet bare, untouched by earth. One hovers over a shoeless crowd, toes perfect and serene. You wonder, did anyone ever sculpt a blister on an angel's heel? Probably not. But wouldn't it be lovely if they had? In tapestries, you notice the hierarchy of feet, nobles in pointed shoes, peasants in clogs or barefoot, clergy in sandals. Their social roles walk right across the woolen threads. Even in fabric, even stitched by hand over years, feet were never ignored. You come across an illuminated book of hours, the page aglow with gold leaf. A tiny figure washes his feet in a bowl, a servant behind him holding fresh hose. This might be the only time today someone's feet feel clean. And finally, you reach a sculpture garden, small, overgrown, a little wild. Most of the figures are headless now. Some are armless. But nearly all still have feet. Carved toes peeking out from robes, from sandals, from the folds of time. Worn down, yes, but still walking, in a way. You crouch beside one, a saint holding a shoe in one hand, pointing downward with the other. His own foot is exposed, one toe cracked, the sole rubbed smooth from centuries of rain. You rest your hand beside it. Even now, even here, the foot speaks. It says, I was part of the journey. I bore the weight. I moved through pain, over dust, into glory. Because in medieval art, feet weren't just body parts, they were metaphors. For progress. For suffering. For the divine, the damned, and everything in between. And whether painted, stitched, or carved, those feet keep walking still, right through the centuries, right into your tired imagination. You leave the sculpture garden behind and follow a narrow, winding lane that leads to a quieter part of the town, less foot traffic, fewer carts, more ivy clinging to stone walls. It smells of age here. Not rot or filth exactly, but of time settling in its corners. You're approaching the twilight of the cobbler's craft. The handmade shoe, the turned shoe, the strapped boot, the stitched slipper, its days are numbered. You can feel it. And so can the man hunched over a creaking workbench in the dim window of a shop with no sign. He's old. Hands stained. Shoulders bowed. But his eyes are sharp as needles, and they flick up only once when you step into the doorway. The tools are all familiar by now, all, waxed thread, wooden last, curved knife. But something feels different. He works slowly, carefully, but with a weariness that tells you he's made this same shoe 1,000 times. Maybe more. And he knows it might be one of the last. The rise of early factories is beginning to reach even this quiet town. Shoemaking is shifting from bench to machine. Division of labor. Standardized sizes. Faster, cheaper, more profitable. The things that built empires and ruined small trades. You watch as he pulls a sole tight against the last and hammers it into place. The shoe is nothing fancy, plain brown leather, iron hobnails, linen lacing, but it's his. Entirely. Every stitch is personal. A boy arrives with a delivery notice. The old cobbler glances at it, snorts softly. Another pair from the city, he mutters. Machine cut. Glue welded. He waves it off like a bad smell. You hear it in his voice, not just bitterness. Resignation. He's seen the change creeping in from the edges. First the merchants selling cheap imports. Then the town tailor offering, half-finished, boots for less coin. Now the wealthy buy from catalogs, custom orders filled in distant cities by faceless hands. Historians still argue whether industrialization killed the cobbler or merely transformed him. Some adapted. Took on repair work. Specialized in luxury or orthopedic designs. Others disappeared, their shops turned into bakeries or barber stalls. The fringe stories are the saddest, cobblers who tried to outpace machines, working night and day until their hands gave out. One tale from Burgundy tells of a shoemaker who died at his bench, his final pair unfinished. His son, a weaver, left the shoes as they were. A museum took them. They still sit there now, half-laced ghosts. The cobbler in front of you isn't dead. But he might as well be forgotten. He wraps the finished shoe in linen, places it beside 5 others. Each pair has a small paper note tucked inside. Names, dates, locations. He still takes pride in getting it right. Even if no one else notices. You glance around his workshop. The floor is worn smooth by decades of pacing. The window pane is streaked with wax smoke. The shelves hold scraps of hide in every shade of brown and gray. Some so dry they crumble to dust at a touch. And on the far wall, a row of old lasts. Foot-shaped blocks carved by hand, labeled in faded ink, Thomas, left foot. Helena, marriage day. Father Bertram, winter boot. None have been used in years. But they remain. Silent witnesses to Saul's long buried. A bell rings outside. The cobbler doesn't flinch. A man in a stiff new coat enters, young, confident, impatient. Are they ready? He asks. The cobbler gestures to a box. The man opens it, pulls out a pair of polished black shoes, sharper, shinier, and clearly not handmade. Factory in Ghent, he says. Cheaper than yours. The cobbler nods once, with a shrug that carries 1,000 losses. The man drops a coin on the bench and leaves. You sit quietly as the cobbler lights a candle. He doesn't speak. He just picks up a child's boot, half-stitched, and starts again. Outside, the streets are changing. Cobblers' shops close. Brick buildings rise. Leather gives way to rubber. Laces become loops. Shoes become products. And yet, walk far enough into any village, peek behind the oldest shutter, and you might still find him. The last cobbler. Holding on to his bench. Making one final pair. You pass another window, this one dusty and dark. Inside, a broken sign. Repair while you wait. The stool is empty. The all lies still. And for a moment, you picture it all, the hands, the thread, the stiff leather turned soft with time and use. Every shoe not just made, but understood. Because machine-made shoes may fit the foot. But handmade shoes remembered its journey. You walk now along the edge of a quiet churchyard, where grass grows longer than it should and the moss has claimed the stone steps without protest. The wind is softer here. The noise of the town fades behind you. Just the occasional caw of a distant crow, the crunch of gravel, and the faint creak of a wooden gate swinging somewhere in the distance. This is where all walks eventually lead. Beneath your feet lie centuries of footsteps stilled. Shoemakers, soldiers, peasants, pilgrims, nobles, children. Their shoes are long gone, mostly rotted to thread and dust. But every now and then, something survives. Archaeologists have found shoes in medieval graves, some wrapped with care, some folded neatly by the head, and some still worn by the deceased, as if they might stand up and walk at any moment. A pair of soft leather slippers in a monk's tomb. A child's turn shoes still curled around tiny toe bones. A woman's boots lined with fur, stitched shut as if to keep the cold out, even in death. You pause near a gravestone tilted sideways. No name left. But someone buried here once walked cobbled roads, tended fires, fetched water, danced in feast halls, and eventually lay down for the last time, probably unaware that their shoes would outlive them. Historians still debate the purpose of burial shoes. Were they meant to ease the soul's journey into the afterlife? Or were they simply practical, one last kindness in a harsh world? Perhaps both. One friar's record from 1387 notes, each brother shall be buried in the manner of his labor, his tools, his robes, and if he so desires, his shoes. It wasn't just the bodies. Shoes were sometimes found buried without their wearers, tucked beneath doorways, hidden in walls, slipped into rafters. A strange medieval superstition held that a shoe, especially a worn one, could trap evil spirits. Like a footprint so familiar even a ghost couldn't ignore it. You pass a small ossuary, bone storage, where a few bits of fabric peek out from under a shelf. Someone has placed a child's leather shoe there. Not from the medieval period, perhaps, but in the spirit of it. A gesture of continuity. Memory worn soft. You sit on a nearby bench and rest your feet, your thoughts drifting to all the souls that came before. They walked muddy roads. Climbed stone stairs. Pressed against cathedral floors. Tiptoed in fear. Marched in battle. Danced in joy. Slipped in winter. Bled. Blistered. Carried everything. And one day, they stopped. A fringe belief in some corners of Europe held that you shouldn't remove a dead person's shoes too soon, or they might become restless. Walkers between worlds. Better to let the shoes stay on. Let them finish their journey in peace. You rise again, walking slowly now through the narrow rows of mossy graves. You find yourself wondering about each life, each step, each pair of feet. What they wore. How they felt. What final path they took. And just as the wind picks up, you spot something near the chapel wall, a half-buried leather sole, blackened with time, still retaining the curve of a heel. Maybe it was buried by chance. Maybe it was left on purpose. Either way, it's a footprint that refused to fade. You imagine it belonged to someone ordinary. A weaver. A tanner. A boy who ran errands in the rain. A woman who stood in doorways waiting for someone who never returned. Someone who once sat by a fire and rubbed their aching feet, not knowing that 700 years later, a stranger would find the ghost of their shoe. And that ghost would whisper, "I was here. I walked. I mattered." In the end, shoes are just leather and thread. But they carry everything. And when they are gone, we still feel them, pressed into the paths they shaped. They're not just tools. They're time travelers. Silent historians. Footnotes in the human story. And now, your feet are tired, too. So now, gently, you can let the images fade. The muddy streets, the cobbler's bench, the soft curve of turn shoes drying by the hearth, all slipping away like footprints in morning frost. Let the rough leather unlace itself, quietly. Let the cracked soles rest beside the fire. No more walking tonight. Let the noise of the market soften, the clang of sabatons fade, the gossip about poulains and straw-lined clogs drift off like smoke from a tallow candle. All of it, gentle now. Distant. Close your eyes and imagine bare feet pressing into soft earth. The cool relief of a stream after a long march. The slow unwinding of linen hose at the end of a weary day. And feel the silence settle over the chapel walls, the monastery gardens, the narrow alleys. There's no hurry anymore. No blisters to tend, no pilgrim badge to earn. You are still. Your feet, finally, can rest. In a world where people walked everywhere, where every journey began and ended on sore heels and hopeful arches, you've followed their path. And now you've come home. Let your breath slow. Let the hush of medieval shoes, their quiet creaks, their worn-down grace, lull you toward sleep. No need to carry the weight any longer. You've walked far enough for one night.